All right, this reading is Genesis 37, verses 1 through 36. So Jacob settled again in the land of Canaan, where his father had lived as a foreigner. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often attended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. And Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children, because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word to him. One night, Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. "Listen to this dream," he said. "We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain. Suddenly my bundles stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine." His brothers responded, "So you think you will be our king, do you? Do you actually think you will reign over us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. Soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. "Listen, I have had another dream," he said. "The sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed low before me." This time he told the dream to his father as well as to his brothers, but his father scolded him. "What kind of dream is that?" he asked. "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow to the ground before you?" But while his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father wondered what the dreams meant. Soon after this, Joseph's brothers went to pasture their father's flocks at Shechem. When they had been gone for some time, Jacob said to Joseph, "Your brothers are pasturing the sheep at Shechem. Get ready, and I will send you to them." "I'm ready to go," Joseph replied. Go and see how your brothers and the flocks are getting along," Jacob said. "Then come back and bring me a report." So Jacob sent him on his way, and Joseph traveled to Shechem from their home in the valley of Hebron. When he arrived there, a man from the area noticed him wandering around the countryside. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "I'm looking for my brothers," Joseph replied. "Do you know where they are pasturing their sheep?" "Yes," the man told him. "They have moved on from here, but I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph followed his brothers to Dothan and found them there. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. "Here comes the dreamer," they said. "Come on, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns. We can tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams." But when Reuben heard of their scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue. "Let's not kill him," he said. "Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into this empty cistern here in the wilderness. Then he'll die without our laying a hand on him." Reuben was secretly planning to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing. Then they grabbed him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty, there was no water in it. Then just as they were sitting down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming toward them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to these Ishmaelite traders. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver. And the traders took him to Egypt. Some time later, Reuben returned to get Joseph out of the cistern. When he discovered that Joseph was missing, he tore his clothes in grief. Then he went back to his brothers and lamented, "The boy is gone. What will I do now?" Then the brothers killed a young goat and dipped Joseph's robe in its blood. They sent the beautiful robe to their father with this message, "Look at what we found. Doesn't this robe belong to your son?" Their father recognized it immediately. "Yes," he said, "it is my son's robe. A wild animal must have eaten him. Joseph has clearly been torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his clothes and dressed himself in burlap. He mourned deeply for his son for a long time. His family all tried to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "I will go to my grave, mourning for my son," he would say, and then he would weep. Meanwhile, the Midianite traders arrived in Egypt, where they sold Joseph to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Potiphar was captain of the palace guard. This is the word of the Lord.
Can we go to the first quote, Kat? This is a quote from Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe in his book, Things Fall Apart. Perhaps down in his heart, Okonkwo was not a cruel man, but his whole life was dominated by fear, the fear of failure and of weakness. It was deeper and more intimate than the fear of evil and capricious gods and of magic, the fear of the forests and of the forces of nature, malevolent, red, that's meant to read in tooth and claw. Okonkwo's fear was greater than these. It was not external, but lay deep within himself. It was the fear of himself, lest he should be found to resemble his father. Those ominous words lie near the beginning of the novel. Or take this quote from rabbi and therapist and organization leadership coach Edwin Friedman. He says, I think we've got another quote here. I have, for example, almost never seen a mother who had a mature relationship with her own mother have any trouble with her daughter. Similarly, I've never saw a highly reactive or hypercritical father who was not distant from his own family of origin and who thereby made the members of his new nuclear family too important to him. Too soon after Father's Day? This morning, we are jumping into the story of Joseph. Joseph, you may or may not know, is one of the most vivid pieces of ancient narrative anywhere in the world. And it, even within the Bible, only has a few rivals for the amount of artwork and literature and typography and imaginative reinterpretation that it has elicited. And part of that's because the storytelling is so rich. We've been in Genesis now, we haven't, but if you read through Genesis, you read through 36 chapters getting up to this point, and it's just kind of galloping along. Sometimes entire generations are summarized with a paragraph, and you get to chapter 37, where we just jumped in, and the lens lingers a little bit. The storycraft, the art of storytelling ratchets up a notch, and we get these tremendous vignettes and these memorable characters like Joseph and his extraordinary Technicolor Dreamcoat. This guy who has these wild, self-aggrandizing dreams. And for many people, Jewish rabbis, for Muslim exegetes, this character, Joseph, has been this example of kind of work ethic. Kind of the Horatio Alger-esque rags to riches story, right? You get some plucky hard work, you get a few lucky breaks, and by dint of this hard work and lucky breaks, you can go from pauperhood to real wealth. Or for others, Christian interpreters, as early as the first few centuries after Jesus, Joseph was seen as a type of Jesus, a foreshadowing of Jesus. But for us, we start with dysfunction, a dysfunctional family. Right, that's where the chapter opened. Jacob is Joseph's dad. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham, the father of the faith. Jacob's other name is Israel. He is the one after whom the entire nation is named. And he and his dad, Isaac, have settled in the land that his father and grandfather immigrated to. It later becomes the Promised Land. They're affluent. They're comfortable, but outside of the Bible, they're not particularly noteworthy. And Joseph, it says, works for his brothers. He joins the family business of tending livestock, and he reports to his half-brothers. Kenneth can tell you it's a real treat working for your brothers. But his job is to report to these brothers, and you'll see verse 2, he ends up reporting on his brothers. He ends up, actually, the Hebrew it paints it sort of in a more negative light. It's he tells daddy evil tales about the brothers. So in this sense, I don't think he's at all a good type of Jesus. I think if we're giving him the benefit of the doubt, he's this sort of spoiled, mean-spirited tattletale. But I think far more likely, in light of the family dynamics we'll see in a moment, I think far more likely he is lying to daddy about his brothers in order to make himself look better. But this is a role that he has learned to play. From whom, you ask? Thanks for asking. From his dad. From his dad. We're told, verse 3, that his dad loved him most. This actually goes back a ways. Jacob, you may or may not remember if you have read the story before, Jacob has fathered these sons by 4 different women. And here it's worth noting that often the Bible is descriptive rather than prescriptive. But he's fathered these women, or these kids, by 4 different women. You might remember the story. He labored for his uncle Laban for 7 years to win the hand of beautiful Rachel, only to find on honeymoon night, surprise, he's with her sister Leah. I mean, can you imagine? For Leah. It's terrible. And then he works another 7 years to win the hand of Rachel, and then add to that favoritism and insecurity and infertility, and no doubt a good helping of libido. And he ends up fathering children not only with Rachel and Leah, but also with their 2 maidservants, respectively, Bilhah and Zilpah. And the degree to which Jacob the father loves the sons is conditioned by the degree to which he loves their moms. All right? So you have this incredibly unstable, unequal, precarious fraternal relationship, and into that, Jacob injects lopsided love. Joseph is the firstborn of the most loved mom, Rachel. And it says Jacob loves him most. He's out front in showing it. Not only does he have the way we think of love, like the emotion of affection, but he also, in the more concrete way, he shows love to Joseph most. He gives him this bespoke, fancy material, expensive coat. Imagine, maybe this happened to you, I hope not, but imagine growing up, your sibling, every birthday gets much nicer presents from mom or from dad or both than you do. Okay, annoying enough. More expensive. But add to that, this gift shows rank. It's meant to convey to the little twerp and to everyone else that this little twerp is the social superior to the brothers. So there he is, meant to be reporting to his half-brothers, primarily the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, the maidservants, so they're bottom of the pecking order. Father loves him most. Father shows him special treatment. And he ends up lying, making up stories about the brothers. And it says, they hated him for it, verse 3. Add to this fact, he ends up having these wild dreams in which he seems to have some sort of promise of prominence and magnificence down the road. And instead of kind of wisely locking these away in his diary and wrestling it through with God and telling no one, he tells his brothers. And he tells his dad with the most sort of lurid, self-aggrandizing detail that you can imagine any 17-year-old dude making up. Right? And he's already got this backstory we've seen, presumably, of making things up, telling lies to make himself look better. And it's in that light that his brothers interpret these dreams, and it just reinforces this conclusion. And even now, doting Jacob, the dad, is like, okay, step too far. The dad then, it says, sometime later, sends Joseph to deliver goods to the brothers who are tending the flocks far off. And he goes part way, can't find him. And at that point, the story might end, but he bumps into an unnamed stranger, we'll call him Mr. Helpful, who knows where the brothers have gone and is willing to tell Joseph. And I want you just to pin those details to the wall of your mind, because later on, as this story goes to deeper and deeper depths of suffering, it's little details like that that are going to ooze. They're going to ooze some of our deeper questions about how can a good God let this happen on his watch, to which we'll come, but not this morning. Joseph finds the brothers, and they see him coming a long way off. They see him coming, and they're like, there's that Lord of the dreams. And they hatch a plan, it says, to rid themselves of him once for all. They'll mug him, they'll kill him, they'll throw him in a cistern, hide the body. Reuben then, the oldest, the firstborn, steps in with a slightly more moderate plan. He's like, let's not kill him. Let's just throw him in the pit and let him die. Some commentators suggest that this is Reuben trying to make up for the fact that a few chapters earlier on, he slept with Bilhah, the mom of some of his brothers. So I don't know what his motivations are here, but I just want you to see that there are layers and layers of dysfunction in this family. And then Judah, some of you who have been around church for a while might know, he's the brother who fathers the line out of which King David comes, out of which Jesus, the King of the universe, will come. His name means points to God or praises God. Judah, verse 27, is like, no, tell you what. Let's just sell him into slavery where he might well die because he's our brother. Seriously? Like, you can't make this stuff up. What sort of brother sells his brother into slavery? Well, the answer, of course, is there have been centuries and centuries, even within our own country, of people who claim to be pointing to God, claim to be praising God, who have sold their brothers and their sisters into slavery. And then traders arrive. And they say, I know what we'll do. We'll just sell him off to the traders, and they can do with him what they will. And so the story ends with Joseph carried off into Africa, and the brothers returning home with a doctored coat dipped in blood. I don't know about you, but it sounds to me like this family has some issues. Right? I mean, I'd wager that for most of us, the family that you grew up in actually has fewer issues, believe it or not, than this family. Which is encouraging, right? Sometimes we grasp at encouragement, but this is encouraging. I remember in the 80s and 90s, which seems like an awful long time ago to I realize to some of you, it's where we get a lot of our music today and hairstyles, but be that as it may. The 80s and 90s, there was a lot of emphasis on functioning and dysfunctional families. Christians in our country, some Christians put a lot of effort into generating resources to sort of shore up what was seen as the traditional Christian family, you know, a mom and a dad faithfully and exclusively married to one another for a lifetime, both present and active and stable in the lives of their kids. And out of that period, a ton of books and other resources were generated. I think in 1999, we've got a book here written by Clifton Talbert. This is called 8 Habits of the Heart. This was published by Penguin Publishing's African American History Imprimatur. That was 99. 94, Chuck Swindoll publishes A Strong Family, The Strong Family. It's these sort of resources that are coming out, and you see two things happening. During that time, the statistics about Christian families are more or less identical to the statistics about non-Christian families when it comes to divorce rates, when it comes to dysfunction in the home, when it comes to single-parent families, when it comes to infidelity, those sorts of things. Christian families look almost exactly the same as non-Christian families. And secondly, the families that are portrayed in media increasingly look nothing like that sort of quote-unquote Christian traditional family that I just told you about a moment ago. And the upshot of it is that about 20 years ago, I'm not sure if you heard it, but there was almost this audible sigh as a lot of people, a lot of Christians in this country were like, the battle is lost. And the other side of that sigh for some was just to dig in further and isolate further. And for others who were just weary, they just let go and went with the flow. And I'm telling you this not because I want to undermine the importance of stable, functioning families, of committed, exclusive, faithful marriages, of present parents. I'm not trying to undermine that. Those things, though they are no guarantee against tragedy and travesty and heartache and disaster and dysfunction, they are the best model that the Bible gives us for a platform from which to withstand those things. But I want you to hear this. God always has been eager to be at work in the middle, even of the most dysfunctional families. When we first moved to this building it's coming up on 11 months ago, I began having conversations with the guys on the block, and a lot of the guys who had been here for years, we would talk about, like, what's changed? What have you seen change in the 30, 40 years that you've lived here at Barclay, Greenmount, 31st? And a lot of them said this. They said, you know what's changed? Family has changed. I remember when I was growing up, every Sunday was mealtime at Grandma's, they'd say. And now, that's not ever happening. Not only is that not ever happening, but you have no respect across generations. And I want to say that is true. I'm not taking anything away from that, but I want to say when you look at the challenges that face families in Baltimore, when you look at what you might see as the dysfunction that is the defining characteristic of your family of origin, when you look at those things, that does not spell the end of the story. In Joseph's case, in the case of the founding families of the people of God, that is the beginning of the story. That's where God's grace starts. Well, tell a lie, not really. It started well before then. But as far as Joseph is concerned, this moment of incredible dysfunction is where God's grace begins to break into his life. Of course, it had started a few generations back, but also a few generations back, these generational sins that issue in this corrosive family environment had also started. For a few minutes, I want to dig into some of these generational sins that we see popping up here. Favoritism, right? Jacob injected lopsided love into an already precarious, unequal family situation. Well, that's nothing new. His paternal grandmother, Rebecca, we are told, Rebecca, chapter 25, loves him more than she loves his twin brother Esau, and his grandfather, or Joseph's grandfather, this is Jacob's dad, Isaac, loves his rugged brother Esau better. We're not just talking about like the sort of situation that occurs in most homes, like mine, where you know one parent's the pushover and the other one's the hard-nosed, and if you want to get something out of the ordinary, like ice cream before lunchtime or camp out on a school night or something, you know which parent to ask. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a situation where both the affection and the acted out, expressed love is lopsided. Think of a magnet with two poles. So this family is pulled apart by these unequal loves, by this favoritism, and each kid is pulled helplessly by the affection of the one parent and pushed helplessly by the coldness of the other parent. And so the two halves of the family end up scheming against the other half in order to get the better of them. But my guess is Isaac learned that from his family of origin. He's just carrying it on. Remember, he was the second son of Abraham. And his older brother Ishmael was seen by Abraham and Sarah so much to be Isaac's inferior that he was chucked out of the house. Favoritism. Favoritism, this ugly, insecurity and jealousy-inducing favoritism is now in Joseph's family, avalanching down from at least 3 generations high. Hatred. 3 times we're told that Joseph's brothers hated him. Interestingly, the first time we're told this is because their father loved him more than he loved them. doesn't say they hated him in response to his lies about them. They hated him. This is a natural, if not excusable, response, of course, to being on the downside of favoritism, of not feeling their father's expressed love to them. But it's also learned. Leah, we're told, Reuben's mom, the mom of a lot of the kids, we're told twice in chapter 29 that she was hated. The sons have learned to hate. I wonder how often the haters we bump into, how often their story has been shaped by not receiving love. Favoritism, generations deep. Hatred now, generations deep. Deceit. Some of you will remember that Jacob, the story opens with Joseph's dad, he worked for his uncle Laban, I've told you, for 7 years, then was tricked. He, in turn, ended up tricking his uncle Laban, who tricked him back. Laban's name, BTW, means white, so don't get too cozy associating colors with sin. And before that, Abraham, the patriarch, the father of the generation before, he had tried to pass off his wife as his sister. Okay, so for generations now, we have deceit in order to put oneself ahead or to escape possible, potential, likely consequences for oneself. And most poignantly in this story, Jacob, who had deceived his aged father Isaac with what? A slain goat and falsified clothes. Chapter closes with him weeping inconsolably because his sons have pulled a ruse on him with a slain goat and falsified clothes. I don't know if you've spent much time reflecting on what might be the generational sins in your family, the kind of harmful behaviors, the destructive beliefs and patterns of relating that get handed down along with the name. But it's worth reflecting on. Pete Scazzero's got a series of books called The Emotionally Healthy, fill in the blank. You know, once you have a bestseller, you just swap out a word in the title and keep on. Emotionally Healthy Relationships. Any of those books are great. They're a Christ-centered way to dig into this, and I would recommend them as a way to begin peeling back the layers of that onion. And doing this can be helpful in many ways, not only because it gives you insights about sort of the pathology, the etiology, why we are the way we are. Like, where does this come from? Now I know. Yes, that's helpful. That's normalizing. But also it gives us inspiration that we can move the needle for another generation by God's grace. I've told you a number of times the story of my father. Staggers me still today. That as a little kid, when I was a little kid, he came night after night to our family devotions and asked his family to pray for his anger issue. And over the course of years, that humility and that transparency and that prayerfulness and that inviting the Spirit to be at work and that hard work of obedience, that broke, I'm convinced, that broke a McFadden generational sin. Don't get me wrong. I get angry. Kenneth certainly gets angry. I can say that because he's not here. He'd beat me up otherwise. But my point is this. It's not that we don't get angry. It's that our battle against anger, the battle of our siblings against anger, to have control over the sort of things that we get angry about and the way we express our anger, our battle against those is markedly easier because our dad did the work of submitting himself to the Spirit, of finding out what his motivations are, of being transparent, of going to God in prayer, of laboring year after year to be obedient, to move the needle. In Pastor King's I Have a Dream speech, partway through he said, I have a dream of a future where one day my 4 kids will live in a... See, he got it. Sin is less like this sort of weather system that blitzes in and then blows on, and it's more like climate change. It sneaks in, and it's with us for generations. And that's not to make you, I don't say that to make you sort of passive, like, oh, it's intractable, there's nothing we can do about it. I say that to make you feel responsible, to make you feel inspired that if you put in the work by God's grace now, if you are obedient to God, if you invite His Spirit to make change in your life, you can be part of transformation, not only in your life, but moving the needle for generations. Praise the Lord. So we've looked at this dysfunctional family. We've looked at these generational sins. And if you've got a moment, I want to walk a little bit further into the mud before we do a U-turn. And that's to say, if this favoritism, if this generational sin of favoritism has created such a ragged edge in this family for generations, what lies underneath the favoritism? There's a 4th century African saint. I don't mean our own Saint Moses. I mean his contemporary, near contemporary, a guy named Augustine. I think his answer to this question would be disordered loves. Disordered loves is what underlies favoritism. Augustine would have said that all sin is a result of disordered loves. When he talks about ordered loves, what he means is the arrangement, the hierarchy in which you love different things or people. The order matters, the series matters, the degree to which you love one thing must be in proportion, must be correctly related to the degree to which you love something else. Because not everything belongs at the top. It's sort of like if you roll your ankle, and then you find yourself sort of limping a bit and shifting your weight to the side a little bit and accommodating that foot, and before you know it, your knee has started to hurt. And then you're back. And the point is that not everything was meant to bear the weight of being God. And when you put something else at the top that is not God, when you put something else, the weight of being God on something or someone who is not God, almost inevitably, you end up crushing them and throwing all the other systems out of joint. I think this insight from St. Augustine about disordered loves is so helpful because it helps us understand why good things can, in some of our hands, be such terribly harmful things. Like money. That's an obvious one, right? Money's basically a neutral thing. With money, you can get lots of wonderful things like avalanche probes and other really important stuff. Jesus says you can't serve both God and money. Or to put it in the language of Paul in 1 Timothy, the God-sized love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. But money's obvious too, right? It doesn't have to be something not obvious. Think of someone who grew up in an environment where they didn't receive much freely expressed affection, right? Heart just cries out for it and longs for it, freely, easily given, spontaneously given affection. Until you find yourself repeatedly wounded by people who tell you what your heart wants to hear when their hearts aren't prepared to back it up. Right? Anything. Wonderful things. Adventure, significance, identity, spouses, kids, potential relationship, success. Any of these things can end up throwing the whole system out of joint if our loves are disordered. As often as not, though, I think the thing that ends up on the top is ourselves. And I think it might just be self that is throwing this whole system out of joint. Verse 3, we're told, this is why Jacob loved Joseph more than his brothers. Do you see it? One line, sort of a cryptic line. It says, because Joseph was born in his old age. Literally, he's the son of his elderliness. And a lot of commentators wisely just do not touch this with a barge pole. They're like, I don't know. And others kind of make a tempest in a teacup and sort of go geriatric psychology on this. I don't think either one of those is warranted. But what I do think here is this is about him. It's about him. I don't know why, because Joseph was born in his old age, he loves him more, but it has to do with him. Like in middle school, when your friend asks you why you've got a crush on so-and-so, and you're like, it's because she laughed at my jokes. Well, that's about you. You love her because of you. Before you think I'm going out on a limb too much here, let's go back one more generation, right? Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob's parents. We're told another sort of cryptic one-liner why it is that Isaac loved Esau more than he loved Jacob. I'll give you the literal translation just to kind of make it as bald as I can. It says, because the venison in his mouth. You hear that? Isaac loved a good steak, and Esau was the son who brought steak home. I mean, to put it that way sounds like laughably trivial. Until you look at the wake of corrosive environment caused by this sort of externalized self-centeredness. It made me stop in my tracks this last week to ask myself, how am I loving and treating my now 3 kids differently? Of course you treat your kids differently. They're different people. But treat them differently based on the degree to which they reflect or fulfill my own predilections. Like, how much are your relationships actually about externalizing yourself? Probably a lot of it. I think there's another old dead person who can help us out here, going a little further. 11th century, there's a French monk named Bernard of Clairvaux, and he's written what is one of the most enduring works on Christian love. It's called Four Loves. Basically, it's almost like a scale of Christian maturity. And he says basically the first degree of love is loving oneself for self's sake. Like, this is natural. We don't have to think about this. This is if you like, this sort of Darwinian impulse that is hard cooked into all of us. We look out for number one. We're good at this. Like, before Torin even knows he is having thoughts, that's my newborn son, before he's even conscious that he's having thoughts, his thoughts are shaped by this, degree number one, loving himself for his own sake. That's where we all begin, and Bernard doesn't chastise us for that. He says that's natural, but he says just as naturally, it tends to run to excess. Self-centeredness, egoism, egotism. And so he says, so Jesus, following Moses, tells us to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Love your neighbor in the same sort of spontaneous, hardwired, urgent, fierce way that you look after your own needs. And it's when we realize that we cannot do that, that when we realize that we are utterly incapable of it, that's what propels us into loving God. Because we simply can't love our neighbors as ourselves. So he says, degree 2 is loving God for self's sake. So my kids love Jill. I mean, they like me. They have fun with me. They love me. But they love Jill. And here's why, right? When his stomach feels hungry, this is before he knows where his toes are, before his visual acuity is sharpened to the point that he can differentiate me across the room from a sort of shiny pink flower pot with moss hanging out of it. Before that ever happens, he knows that when his tummy gets hungry, the smell of mom's body, the sound of mom's voice, the feel of Jill's arms is gospel to him. It's good news. He loves mom for his own sake. And one day when he's a little bit more mature, he'll realize that Dad's the pushover. And then third degree, let me pause. Second degree, if we're honest with ourselves, for how many of us does this characterize our love of God? We love him because of what he gives us. And Bernard doesn't chastise us for that. He just beckons us on further. Love of God for God's sake. Those of us who love the Reformed tradition or owe the debt to the Reformed tradition think this is the filet mignon. Loving God for his godness. We love God because of his gifts. That's degree 2. But in degree 3, we're loving God through his gifts or even in the absence of his gifts. We love him just because he's so utterly worth it. We love God for his own sake, and relational theologian Julie Canlis says it's in this third degree that believers are able to go through great spiritual deserts, through personal tragedy and more, because their love has matured to an awareness that God does not simply exist to serve their own whims. I would have stopped there. Who can top that? Who dares top that? Well, Bernard did. Bernard says there's a fourth degree. There's a fourth degree of love, and this is what he says it is. It's loving self for God's sake. Loving ourselves is natural. There is maybe no doctrine that our culture disciples us in better than love yourself, be yourself, do your own thing. But there are two different ways of loving yourself. Degree 1 and degree 4. And which one we, friends, inhabit makes all the difference for the way we relate to God and the way we relate to other people. It makes all the difference in the systems of relationships around us. And in this fourth degree, we're not trying to posture to cover over our weaknesses. We're not blowing smoke to make up for our inadequacies. We're not loathing ourselves because of our failures. Instead, we are seeing ourselves as God sees us, with an unconditional, enrapturing, transforming love. Canlis says it's in this fourth degree that we realize that who we are has been made by God. It doesn't mean we're perfect. We have been lovingly made by God for himself and for the world with unique gifts for praising God and loving other people. How different is that than degree 1? What a stable, solid, weatherproof place from which to relate to others. But just like Augustine's order of loves, Bernard's degrees of love, it all hinges on our relationship with God. Even degree 4 of loving yourself for God's sake hinges on your degree for God. Where I want to leave you this morning is that the way forward in our dysfunctional families, or our sort of non-biological families, our church family and the network of friends and people in your life, the way forward there is by focusing on your love for God. You're like, wow, Ian, you're telling me, look, get this, preacher, you're telling me that in all the welter of complexity of relationships, all I got to do is love God more. Like, seriously? That's like preschool Sunday school. It's too simple. I'd say yes, but. Relationships are systems, right? What you do in one place affects other places. So I'm not saying we focus on our relationship with God to the to the exclusion of focusing on anything else. I'm saying we focus on a relationship with God because it has the most power to affect everything else. So I'm a concert trombonist. Thank you. Kiana, the musician, laughs because she knows that's a lie. I asked Jill for an illustration. It's always helpful having a wife who's a theologian and a musician as well. And she told me, she said, when you're learning to play the trombone or any other musical instrument that's not keyed and not fretted, the way you hit the pitch you're going for perfectly, in the case of the trombone, is a combination of things, right? It's the embouchure, the shape and tenseness of your mouth, the way you're buzzing with your lips. It has to do with your breath support. Especially it has to do with muscle memory. Like, I'm probably not even holding this in the right hand, but it has to do with muscle memory, like how far out your arm is when you're trying to make a certain note, like whether it's extended or midway. And hitting the right note depends on having your slide in exactly the right position, combined with your mouth doing the right thing and the right amount of air going through. But you can be doing those things perfectly. And if you haven't adjusted your tuning valve, it doesn't matter how good your embouchure is, it doesn't matter how good your muscle memory is, you are going to be out of tune, and every perfectly executed note you play is gonna sound wrong. Or take an instrument like a violin or a really high-end guitar. It's voiced. When the luthier, or whatever a violin maker is called, we'll call him Stradivarius, is making one, that person, that craftsperson, tunes the wood to resonate best at a certain pitch. So if I got up here with my violin and I tuned it not to A 440, but to A sharp, and then I got all of the other strings relatively in tune to that sharp A, all of those strings would be in tune to each other. But the violin is never going to sing like it was made to sing. And some of you are just in a rut in your marriage. Some of you aren't sure what the way forward is in your dating relationship. Some of you aren't in a relationship and you desperately want to be. Some of you aren't sure how to parent your kids now, and you're working through what it was like when you were growing up. And I would say, do that work, but do not neglect focusing on first-order love. Because when we come back to Joseph in a few chapters, when he is rejoined with his family, everything is different because of his relationship with God. Let's pray.